Welcome back to the Shark Trust podcast. This is a special update episode. So this is on the back of the IOTC, Indian Ocean Tuna Commission meeting that happened last week in Marley. Now, if you've never heard of IOTC before, do not worry. In this episode, you're going to find out what it's about, how it works, and why, with shark conservation progress in these meetings, it takes long negotiations, a little bit of compromise, and a lot of perseverance. To help break this down, we're going to be joined by Shark Trust Director of Conservation, Ali Hood, who has been out there. My name is Mark Stokes-Packer, and you're listening to the Shark Trust podcast. Ali, welcome back to the Shark Trust podcast. It's kind of funny, it's actually exactly 2 years that we're recording this, that the first episode of you came out.
Okay.
So it's a nice little anniversary. Now, I'm not going to go into the massive detail of your background because they can go and listen to that episode to learn all about that. I want to go straight into what you've just come from. Okay. So you've come back from the Maldives, from this massive week-long no sleep meeting.
Wasn't quite that bad. But we were at Sharks International the week prior to that, which was fortunately very close geographically. So it made a really sweet segue from Sharks International into IOTC and then straight into an ICAT meeting. So forgive me if I'm a little,
That's okay. To put it into context, Ali is recording this in the lunch break of ICAT and then she'll be going straight back into the meeting. So a huge dedication. I love it. For those who aren't necessarily familiar with what IOTC is, can you tell us what is it? Why is it important?
Well, IOTC is one of the 5 tuna RFMOs, the Regional Fisheries Management Organisations. So these large bodies that manage those high seas pelagic fisheries. And while their focus is on tuna, they all also have a remit for the tuna-like species, which is where the sharks come in. So we're sort of in the brackets at the end, but we're increasingly raising them up that profile. At different stages in different tuna RFMOs. So the Atlantic is in one place, the IOTC, the Indian Ocean is in one place, similarly the Pacific. And our involvement in IOTC is a little fresher than that for the Atlantic. But there's a lot of work to be achieved there and a lot of work that we can contribute to.
Why do you think it's such an important region for shark conservation at the moment?
Well, I think specifically there is a great deal of sharks caught within those fisheries. So there's a need for management and there's a need for organisations to champion the prioritisation of management for those species. We also see management coming from the Pacific that we might that's influencing the Indian Ocean, and we might want to see some of that a little bit more robust. So we're bringing some of the practices, some of the experiences we've had in the Atlantic and tailoring them because every ocean basin has different needs. Every fishery is slightly different, but tailoring those experiences to the benefit of sharks in the Indian Ocean.
And then this year, going into this meeting, what were kind of the major issues that were going to be discussed for sharks and rays specifically?
Well, issues and opportunities. I want to be very clear on that. There's always opportunities to be had. So this was the 30th meeting of IOTC, so the 30th year of this sort of process. We've not been involved that long, but and coming out of last year's meeting where there was a large consolidated shark proposal. They brought together a number of the shark resolutions and created a large shark resolution out of these individual ones. We were very keen to see progress. That there's potential within that consolidated proposal. It's not something we prefer. We prefer to see the shark resolutions kept as independent items for a number of reasons we won't go into right now. But this consolidated proposal, it has potential within it, providing all of the date points, providing all of the operative paragraphs so that the pieces on individual species or on individual bycatch mitigation measures are actually enacted. So it's about scrutiny. But there was a proposal that came forward from one party to amend aspects of the consolidated proposal. So that was something that we were paying a lot of close attention to because we didn't necessarily agree with what was being put on the table. There was then another 2 proposals, both of them on the same resolution, so to revise the resolution on Mobulid Rays. One there came from the EU and one came from the Maldives. They both had a very similar intent, And what always happens in these meetings where you have two proposals on the same resolution, the immediate action of the chair is to say, you guys go away, bring one item back to the table that we can consider as the Commission, so as all of the parties, the countries that are part of the IOTC.
Absolutely amazing. And how were you feeling going into the meeting?
Well, Mark, I always have to go into these meetings optimistic. It's essential. I mean, it's optimism with a big dose of reality, but we're always optimistic that we can make change because we have evidenced this over the years that change is possible. It may be incremental. It may not be as extensive as we hope for, but you have to reach for that higher point. And so, always optimistic, always keen to believe that the parties will look to the science and will follow that science, but also conscious that there is many aspects at play beyond science. There's the politics, there's the vested interests, these are profit-making management bodies, they're interested in the profits from the fisheries. But then, as I said earlier, all of these RFMOs are different, and IOTC has perhaps a stronger acknowledgement of the subsistence and artisanal fisheries. So there are different facets to how decisions progress through the IOTC process.
When you're in these meetings, like you said, where the chair might ask for two countries to go and look at a proposal, kind of put them together, how's the Shark Trust, how are NGOs involved in those kind of negotiations? What role do we have in those meetings?
Well, our role in these meetings starts almost 12 months earlier. It almost starts during the previous Commission meeting. So there will be things, as I said, there's things in the consolidated proposal that we weren't so comfortable with. So we're already starting and already working on, voicing our concern, and we would have voiced our concern at the time for those aspects that we didn't think were strong enough, robust enough, or in fact, needed to be addressed in different ways. We then attend the intersessional meetings. So these are meetings through the year of different working parties or expert groups, which provide at times more informal opportunity to contribute into the discussions. And as you travel towards that Commission meeting, the meetings get more and more formal. And as observers, our influence changes, it evolves. We also, during that period, have the chance to contribute to stakeholder meetings. So being that we're based in the UK, we contribute to meetings with the UK government, who are a party to IOTC. And we also contribute to EU stakeholder meetings, which again enables us to directly engage with parties as to what are needs, concerns, what information is available to them to guide their decisions. And then on top of that, we can engage with all of the other parties in writing, in direct conversation. And it's really important to establish those views much, much earlier than the Commission meeting, because by that time, the proposals are on the table, or there's no proposals and you needed to have encouraged something to be present. Or in fact, the recommendations, and these are very important, the recommendations that come out of previous working groups or committees are strong enough to power through those the aspects of the proposals that have looked for advice. And we'll come to why that's a particular issue this year in a moment.
If we now go into what happened when you were there, can we start off with the mobulids, or mantas and mobulids? So this outcome seemed quite positive.
It was definitely more positive than not. It could have been stronger. All these things can always be stronger. Yes, so we had these two proposals. This is a resolution, so they were proposals to amend an existing resolution. For those of you that follow ICAT commentary, they're called recommendations in ICAT. They're resolutions in IOTC. So the resolution is the law that goes into place, the binding resolution, unless you take a reservation to a resolution, and that means it won't apply to you. But this is where the lack of sleep and language comes into play. So these two revised or proposals for revision to the resolution were looking at taking out time-expired clauses, which was just sort of neatening up the process, but also specifically looking to improve the handling information for mobulids. This is a big issue. If you have where you have a prohibition, that doesn't mean the species won't be encountered, it won't be caught. And with all elasmobranch species, how they're handled preferably not on deck, but if a species lands on deck, how is that handled in the best way to improve the chances of post-release survival is really, really important. There's also the need to take into account crew safety. So handling advice has been developed across the RFMOs, and IOTC have put significant time into this in the last 18 months to create guidance for the fishermen as to how best to handle each species, what equipment they require on their vessels, and how this can then improve post-release survival, which contributes in time to population rebuilding. So it's really important to have as many elasmobranchs back into the water in as best state as possible, as quickly as possible, with the safety of the fishes in mind. And so for the mobulids, which are not part of this wider consolidated shark resolution, the mobulids had quite significant additional text put into their resolutions on handling. The Maldives have gone further and had added some fantastic illustrations which really showed very clearly how you should achieve this. The EU version didn't have that. There was some debate about how specific the text was versus the illustrations, and so unfortunately by the end of the process the illustrations were redacted from the product, but we have come back in and suggested that that's a companion piece, because levels of literacy, levels of language, visual guides are really important in all fleets globally, but it's felt to be particularly important in the Indian Ocean region. So the positive thing to take from this is that there are now quite comprehensive handling guides and equipment requirements on the vessels within the Indian Ocean for Mobulid Rays. So hopefully we see better discard reporting, because that's really important, but also better post-release survival for mobulids.
And I remember when you just got back, and I spoke to you on Tuesday, I think, you were saying it's so important because in the Indian Ocean, they've got some of the highest levels of bycatch of mantis and mobulids. Yeah. So hopefully this will have a massive change.
Very true, Mark. The Indian Ocean has the highest global level of catch of Mobulid Rays. And so it is a focal area, really important to address this. And we've discussed this at some length with the Mantis Trust as well. And the illustrations that I just mentioned, they've come from some Mantis Trust materials as well, which is great. So it's really important that we address these priority issue areas. And handling is such a key aspect. One of the meetings that I'm in at the moment, there was a clear demonstration of a 100% increase in post-release survival of a certain shark species if it was just handled in a slightly different way than is usually. And so, these small tweaks, these behaviour changes they can pay big dividends.
If we now go into that other big, massive, consolidated shark resolution from last year, what actually has happened there? Can you explain what's going on and how it got so complicated?
2508. It brings together a host of prior resolutions, all of which are written slightly differently. So you may have species which have prohibitions or have specific measures, and in each of those previous resolutions the language will be slightly different, and so it sometimes makes it quite hard to consolidate things, because people then want to align, and as soon as you try and align the language, that brings into play someone may have an objection to a change in that language, or by aligning you might be weakening some of the language, and we've seen this in other RFMOs. So it's really important. We always say the devil is in the detail. Those small words make a massive difference. If something suddenly goes from and to or, you've potentially gutted the effectiveness of part of it. And I mean, that happened in the consolidated development to the consolidated proposal last year, where it went from a suggestion to prohibit the use of wire leaders and shark lines, which are the lines that come off the top of the floats on a long line, to wire leaders or shark lines. And so people went for shark lines, and the wire leader trials now are something that is we really need to see momentum maintained on the wire leader trials, and keeping a host, a diversity of species involved in those trials. And that's one of the issues that came up this year. But there's a lot of potential in this consolidated proposal, and this is where scrutiny comes into play. But also, as is the way with with these resolutions, they don't come into force the end day of the meeting. They come into force down the line. So this resolution that was adopted last year came into force on January 1st this year. So at the meeting that we've just had in May, there wasn't a full year of data. In fact, that data won't have been submitted for consideration. That data won't be submitted, a full year of data for consideration, until 2027. And the scientific committee meeting for IOTC is always in December. So you're always working several years in arrears. So to see how effective these measures are may take a number of years to actually see them in action and having that access to that full data set, which is really, really valuable. So meanwhile, there's many things you can still keep scrutiny on, and it's, are countries reporting for compliance as required? There's a full utilisation clause in there, which is a finning regulation, but it has alternative measures. So as you know, we're proponents of fins naturally attached. If a fin has to stay naturally attached, there can be no shenanigans in the process. But IOTC have adopted alternative measures for countries who've registered those measures. They had to register them last year. And every year now, the onus is on those countries to report how they've delivered. And if they don't report effectively or to a high enough standard, then they revert to fins naturally attached. And in a few years' time, that will be reviewed as a whole and seen if those alternative measures are actually appropriate. So we need to see strong scrutiny on the reporting there to make sure that countries are reporting. If they aren't, that they're then shifted to fins naturally attached, so on and so forth. So there are a number of points within this process that, scrutiny is really required.
When would those bits of information be coming along this year-long process?
They are fed into the compliance committee meeting, which is usually a few weeks prior or a week prior to the committee meeting. And IOTC also have a meeting prior to compliance where people discuss the implementation of what's called a CMM, a conservation management measure. And actually, I find that a really useful meeting because it's a little bit more informal, and it's an opportunity to discuss how, what's going to come up at compliance and how those CMMs, those conservation management measures, are actually being enacted. So there are a number of points down that process where there'll be date points for the parties to submit their reports, and there is a requirement to do that. And then those feed into meetings as they go along the line. And then you get to the commission meeting, as we had last week, and the chairs of those previous meetings will give a report. But obviously that's distilled down. It'll be a week's worth of meeting distilled into an hour's presentation or something. So this is why it's really important to be part of those prior processes, because you understand the detail, you understand the nuance, who was influencing what in the room, who brought what to the table. Because if it's been condensed down to a sentence, you're missing a lot of the texture and the discussion and the debate behind that sentence. And it's really, really valuable to have that, to understand how processes develop and how decisions are made.
Hypothetically, if one of the chairs was talking in the commission meeting at the end, given a summary of one of these meetings, is there a way that you'd be like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right? Or is it not like that?
So the presentation of the chair doesn't reflect my recollection of the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where it's really, really important to look at the recommendations that come out of a meeting. So we're in IOTC. A recommendation is a statement, not a resolution.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got to hold on to these words. So the recommendations that come out of these working groups or these committees, this is why you need to stay to the end, because that's when they're agreed and the language is agreed. And so it's really important to follow those recommendations through to that endpoint, so you see what the final text is, and then to ensure that things that we feel are important are still enshrined in that text. And if we think something's missing, we can flag it ourselves. We can encourage sympathetic countries or parties to flag it as well, to get the science community to question or submit something. But it's really, really important that those recommendations are tight, because as we saw this year with the whale shark, when the language isn't explicit and unambiguous, it can cost you a year's worth of protection for a species, because there is scope for countries, in this instance one country, to sort of challenge and pick holes from a process perspective. not necessarily from a conservation perspective, but they can say the process wasn't followed, the language wasn't explicit and unambiguous, therefore we will not act, which is immensely frustrating.
I can imagine. Let's go straight into that.
Yeah.
Can you say what is it that was proposed to happen, and then what actually happened?
So the proposal for the revisions to 2508, the consolidated shark proposal, were brought forward by Japan, and they were quite small suggestions for change, but they, as we've just said, small is where you need to really pay attention. Some of them related to blue shark, and this was to do with things like wire trace trials, and those were addressed. Blue shark are essential for wire trace trials, along with vulnerable species. But blue shark are recognised as a target species within IOTC fisheries. What we need to see is management for them. Unfortunately, that didn't come through this year, but we're still working on that. The issue where the language was not explicit and unambiguous enough was for whale sharks. Whale sharks at the moment have a prohibition on setting purse seine nets on them, but the proposal was to step them up to a full prohibition. And the whale sharks were therefore written into the consolidated as a sort of, they're in the list of prohibited species, but that's in paragraph 3. Go all the way through to paragraph 45, and you'll find a little clause that says, subject to the scientific committee recognising that they're species of the greatest biological concern or vulnerability and conservation concern, and to explicitly and unambiguously state that a prohibition is required. So this is where the issues come in, because a country can take that and say, well, was that done, yes or no? That then affects the whale shark's position. So unfortunately, the recommendation that came out of the scientific committee, yes, did state they were a species of the highest conservation concern and biological vulnerability, and that precautionary management was required, but they didn't then state what that precautionary management should be. So this comes back to the need to be in the room. And this meeting was held in China. It was literally, in the middle of our night. And, it frustrates me that we weren't on the ball enough on this line. Now, we're not the only people in that room, but I will take it personally. We should have been on the ball on that, and we should have been there to ensure that line was explicit and unambiguous. The chair was asked to explain this during the commission meeting last week. Is no retention an appropriate precautionary management measure? And he did say yes. That was later retracted. And so, unfortunately, despite really strong support from other parties on the floor that feel, it's a whale shark are an obvious candidate for full prohibition. They have full prohibition in the Atlantic, in the Western Central Pacific. They are now CITES Appendix 1, so you can't internationally trade. They're CMS Appendix 1, which means all those CMS parties should be prohibiting them in their own domestic waters. In fact, the CITES proposal, the proponent was the Maldives, and 6 of the IOTC parties were co-sponsors of that. So there's very, very strong support, and I don't think anyone would challenge the need for that protection for a whale shark. There's also a host of non-conservation concerns and benefits of whale sharks. They have cultural significance. They have other economic value to the region, particularly for ecotourism. They're a big draw for ecotourism ventures. And so there was, accordingly, really strong support from the parties, and we had very strong support within the NGO community as well. We put forward an intervention, really pushing for the full protection for the species. But it is the prerogative of a country. These are consensus decision-making for us, so everyone needs to agree. And Japan felt that the process wasn't appropriately followed here, that the scientific committee hadn't been clear, explicit and unambiguous in their statement, and they withdrew their proposal. Now, sometimes, as we've spoken about before, that can be a good thing, because sometimes changing stuff can weaken it. And by withdrawing all of the other points for blue sharks, that they're lost. They're gone. They've dissolved in a good way. So blue shark remain in all of those points. Yeah. But this left the whale shark in a little bit of limbo. So it had a date point in 2026. The Commission shall decide if it becomes a prohibited species. Now, we've talked about this timeline. We've talked about the meetings that influenced the Commission meeting. So what then had to happen was that we had to ensure that parties asked the Commission to, well, they're part of the Commission, but asked the Commission to give clear request back to the Scientific Committee to give new advice to the next Commission meeting, a new recommendation for whale shark. So we have to put it back in that process. It's like snakes and ladders. You've got to go down, you've got to come back up round again. But without that instruction, without the Commission specifically requesting of the Scientific Committee to provide a recommendation on whale shark, it wouldn't happen. So it's not just a logical, oh, we did it last year, we'll do it again. Yeah. They have to be explicitly requested to do it. So at the end of the meeting, there was a paper put in by the UK, Australia, the EU, making explicit request for that process to start again. So we now have a period up until the next scientific committee meeting, which is in December, to ensure that a very strong case is put forward for why whale sharks should be fully prohibited in the Indian Ocean. And that might sound like a really obvious thing, but it's consensus. So we have to ensure that the case is watertight.
That does sound massively frustrating. Not only because of all of the work that's gone in, but that's now a species that's got a whole other year to wait.
What I would say is I think you'll find that most countries, people aren't retaining whale shark. Yeah. It's just the need for it. It just reinforces that fact. Yeah. That they're prohibited, if we can get it written into
text. So what happens now for us, like for the Shark Trust? What are our next steps?
So, as I said, the consolidated shark proposal has a host of opportunity in it, and we need to really start working those opportunities, making sure that the parties are conscious of what they are, that they start acting sooner rather than later. And, when we go to these meetings, we're not solely focused on these shark measures. There's a host of other resolutions and proposals around this that all contribute to effective fisheries management. And that might be on aggregating devices. It might be on high seas boarding initiatives. There's a host of different factors that go into these fisheries that affect how the sharks are encountered or handled or reported. And so a lot of these aspects need to be considered as well. So we're not solely focused on those shark proposals. And, as in anything in life, if there's good management secured for one species, that will have either knock-on effects, good or bad, to others. And, we saw historically in the Atlantic where an increased level of management for swordfish actually resulted in an increased retention of sharks to fill the quota gaps. So you always have to be conscious of what the ramifications of one thing are on another, and to look really at a broad picture of what's going on within that particular management body. So, we are fortunate to be involved in the development of the new research plan for IOTC, which is fantastic. We're looking at all sorts of aspects within that, including capacity building, including looking at how we can engage a wider community of scientists in the process, because there's an awful lot of data out there that doesn't get engaged into these RFMO management processes. So there's a lot of opportunity in the next run up to the next Commission meeting next year. But our focus at the moment will be on that research plan and on the Scientific Council meeting that's coming up.
While this is all going on, it's not just the Indian Ocean that we're focusing on. There's the Atlantic, all the other tuna RFMOs. What's next specifically for you?
Oh my goodness, some lunch.
Some lunch, hopefully.
No, I mean, this is something we talk about, the fact that the timescales and the process timelines for each of these RFMOs are offset. So while, for example, today we're in an ecosystems and bycatch meeting for ICAT, and their annual meeting is in October. So we have the short fin maker stock assessment coming up in June, which is a really important point for us, one we follow very, very closely and are directly engaged in. So there's then into the early autumn, into September, October, there's a number of working groups, and that all then feed the Commission meeting for ICAT, which is in the November time. following that, we'll then run into the IOTC Scientific Council meeting and other aspects. But these offset lines mean it's really fascinating because you're learning something in one ocean basin that is applicable to another, but it's out of sync with their process. But it all contributes to a wider knowledge. But I will confess at times you get a little confused as to which basin you're working in at that time and who said what, because there's also helpfully a number of individuals who do cross over those RFMOs. So you'll see some of the same characters, which actually eases the working process as well, because you already know each other and you already know your angle and where you're coming from. And, we are science-based as an organisation. So it's important to contribute that into the room and make sure people understand why we're there and what our interests and perspectives and intentions are.
I think it reminds me from ICAT back in November. And you were talking about having those relationships with different people and how important it can be when there is a proposal up and something needs to change in it. You know that person, you can go and talk to them and get those changes in.
And more to the point, they know you.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important because, we are an NGO, we are observers, but by being involved through the whole process, the chairs of certain working parties or committees, or even just the delegations from each of the parties, they know us, they know the perspective that we bring, and therefore they know whether they will feel how much credibility they will put into what we're bringing to the table. And that's really important. So those relationships that you develop through that process are vitally important when it comes to the crunch. And this is when you have to be really careful, because at the end of all of the RFMO meetings, things start happening quickly and people are tired. And this is when language can squeeze through that perhaps isn't scrutinised at the level it should be. That's when it's really, really important to make sure that the numbers make sense and the text makes sense and there isn't these little words, that it is robust enough, that it has got date times and points in it that allow decent scrutiny. And so, yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah. Just highlighting the point, the importance of trust and credibility kind of in that, so that the fragile process doesn't go backwards for us. Ali, that is all we have time for today. My voice is getting a bit scratchy. Thank you for joining us for an update. Please go get some lunch and get back into your next meeting. But thank you so much for explaining all of that.
Do I want to say anything more? I do actually. So our involvement in the Indian Ocean is thanks to our Big Shark Pledge community. So we are there from community fundraising, and I hope what we've discussed has shown that the importance and the value of being in the room. You really need to be able to talk directly to people to understand what's happening, what the processes are, and you can only do that being in the room. You can follow certain meetings online, and that's okay, but for those really crunchy ones, you need to be there. That is enabled by our Big Shark Pledge community. And so I've got to say an immense thank you to the community who've helped fundraise, and to you, because you've gathered all these fundraisers together as well. But that's what gets us in the room. That's what gets us able to champion these sharks and rays and to really be as effective as possible as an NGO, as observers to this process. So, significant thanks are due to that community, and please do continue to support us in these processes. It's really valuable.
If you want to support us, you can just email me at mark@sharktrust.org. But please also sign the Big Shark Pledge. Use your voice for these species at bigsharkpledge.org.
So one thing that happened this year that we haven't had happen before was, off the back of Sharks International, we had over 850 scientists in the region, and two of them from Nick Dalby's lab in Vancouver. So Amanda and Rachel decided to give up some of their holiday to come and join the IOTC meeting, to come as observers and see the process firsthand for themselves. And we were fortunately able to get them onto the Shark Trust delegation. And in fact, the welcome that they received from the IOTC Secretariat was really positive, because it's really important that we get more scientists understanding this whole process, this whole timeline of opportunity to contribute their science, to really ensure their research is applied as effectively as possible to maximise that value. And so when we get to the commission meeting, it's from a really informed position. So while the ladies joined us at that end point, it meant they could really see how science was represented in that room, how language was so key, and we've talked a lot about that today, and just the nature of the processes and how very few scientists are left in that room by that stage. And their take home really was, the decisions here are made with all those influencing factors that are beyond science. And I'm really excited to see how they engage into the future. But having Amanda and Rachel along was a really positive facet to what we did there. And I think hopefully a starting point to seeing more scientists, more researchers involved through that whole process, and maybe tailoring their science to the questions asked by the RFMOs, or seeing how their existing science can really contribute into that process. So it's all good.
If you would like to learn more about the Shark Trust works in international fisheries, please go on our website, sharktrust.org, go onto the Oceanic programme, and you will see everything that Ali does and all the amazing work there. If you've enjoyed this episode, please follow, like, share, and give us a rating. This helps us reach those extra people, expands our audience to get involved in our conservation work. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode, which will be back to Series 2, Living with Sharks.